There is a particular kind of silence that arrives not with peace, but with a quiet unease you cannot quite name. It does not announce itself. It does not shake the walls or break anything visible. It simply settles, like dust after a long movement has finally stopped, and suddenly you are standing in the middle of your own life, wondering why none of it feels the way it used to. You look around at the same faces, the same routines, the same conversations that once carried weight, and something inside you has gone still in a way that feels less like rest and more like distance. Not the kind of distance that comes from being far away geographically, but the kind that comes from standing right next to someone and realizing that whatever used to connect you to that moment is no longer operating the way it once did. You are still there. You show up. You laugh when it seems appropriate. You answer the questions. You go through the movements. You participate in the rhythm of days that everyone around you seems to be living without apparent confusion. And yet, beneath all of that, there is something you keep returning to in quieter moments, something you might not have told anyone, because the words for it feel embarrassing or ungrateful or impossible to explain without sounding like you are complaining about nothing. The something is this: things that used to matter to you have slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped mattering in the same way. Not because something terrible happened, not because you went through a crisis anyone would point to and say, yes, that explains it. It happened gradually, and then all at once. And now you find yourself standing in the wreckage of your own interest, in the life you are living, unsure whether this is a beginning or an ending or something else entirely that does not have a name yet. Maybe it started with a conversation that felt suddenly hollow. Someone was talking, and the words were landing on you but not entering, like rain on glass. You nodded, you responded, and the whole time there was a part of you watching from a slight remove, noticing that the performance was flawless and the feeling was absent. Or maybe it started earlier, in a moment of unexpected quiet, a night when nothing was wrong, a morning that had all the ingredients for contentment, and still something in you felt like a radio tuned between stations, picking up only static where music used to be. You noticed it and moved on. Then you noticed it again, then it became the thing you carry. The truly unsettling part is not just that the feeling is there. It is that you cannot find the source. There is no clear reason. There is no obvious wound. There is no one to blame, including yourself, which in some ways makes it harder, because at least blame would be something to do with your hands. Instead, you are left with this unanswered question that you revisit at odd hours. What is happening to me? That question has probably taken on some darker variations. You have probably asked yourself whether you are becoming depressed, not in an abstract clinical sense, but in a private, frightened sense, the kind where you lie there at a certain hour of the night and think, maybe something is genuinely wrong with me. Maybe I am broken in some way I cannot see. Maybe I have crossed some invisible line, and the version of me that used to feel connected to things is gone now. And what is left is this cooler, quieter, more removed person who watches everything from a distance and cannot find the way back in. That thought carries a specific kind of weight. It is not dramatic. It is very quiet and very heavy, and it tends to arrive when there is nothing left to distract you from it. And alongside that fear, almost inevitably, comes its companion, self-accusation. Because if you cannot locate an external cause, the mind almost always turns inward and begins to construct one. So you tell yourself that maybe you are selfish, that you have become cold, that the people around you deserve more warmth than you seem capable of generating right now, and that your inability to summon it on demand is evidence of some fundamental failure of character. You accuse yourself of arrogance, the kind that refuses to be impressed or moved, the kind that has decided somewhere below conscious thought that it has seen enough and understood enough and does not need to be surprised anymore. You wonder if you have become the kind of person who thinks too much and feels too little, who has gone so far into their own head that the world of ordinary human warmth and spontaneous joy has become inaccessible. A person who is always slightly watching, slightly analyzing, slightly apart, never quite arriving in the moment the way other people seem to arrive. You might have even said some version of this to someone you trust, and they probably said something kind, something reassuring, something meant to help, that did not quite reach the place you needed it to reach, because the place you needed it to reach is somewhere that reassurance cannot access through ordinary channels. What you are experiencing is not primarily a wound that needs comforting. It is a question that needs a completely different kind of answer. Here is what that different kind of answer might look like. not as a solution, not as a cure, not as a revelation that rearranges everything into sudden clarity, but as something more modest and more real, a shift in the frame through which you are interpreting what is happening to you. Because the interpretation you have been using, the one that says something is wrong, that you are broken or cold or fading, that interpretation, while completely understandable, may be working against the very thing it is trying to protect. What if this is not a collapse? What if what you are experiencing is not the deterioration of who you are, but a fundamental reorganization of how you relate to existence? What if the distance you feel, the quiet that has settled in, the loss of appetite for certain stimulations that once felt necessary, what if none of that is evidence of decay, but evidence of a transition so deep and so structural that your entire previous way of being present in the world can no longer function as it once did, not because it failed, but because you have, without entirely meaning, outgrown it? That is not a comforting idea in the way comfort usually works. It does not make the feeling go away. It does not restore the warmth or the ease or the spontaneous enthusiasm that used to come naturally, but it changes what the feeling means. And sometimes, changing what something means is the most significant thing that can happen, more significant than changing how it feels, because meaning shapes everything that comes after. Think about what it is like to watch a film for the second time, knowing how it ends. The experience is completely different. Certain moments land differently. Certain lines carry different weight. Certain choices by the characters make sense in ways they could not the first time through. You are watching the same images, but you, the person in the seat, have changed in a specific way, and that change makes the entire experience something else. Now imagine that this happens not with a film, but with your entire mode of experiencing reality. Imagine that something in you has learned how certain scenes end, has recognized certain patterns, has through some combination of attention and experience and whatever constitutes the maturation of a person's inner life, started to see behind certain mechanisms that once held complete power over it. The scenes are still playing, but you, the person watching, have changed in a way that makes full re-immersion in the old experience not quite possible anymore. The question then is not how to get back to the person who could watch it for the first time. The question is who you are becoming in the space created by the shift. Consider a person who has spent years in a particular room, and that room is vivid and warm and full of things that seem real and important. The colors are bright, the textures are interesting. The sounds are familiar and in some ways reassuring, even when they are not pleasant because they are known. And then, gradually, something in the quality of the light in that room begins to change. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but the colors that seem so vivid begin to appear slightly more constructed, slightly less like the thing itself, and more like a representation of it. The textures begin to feel, upon closer examination, slightly staged, and the sounds which were always familiar begin to sound faintly like a recording rather than the sounds themselves. The room has not changed, but the person in it has changed in their capacity to see it, and now they are experiencing something deeply disorienting. The discovery that what felt like reality was always partly a construction, not a lie, just a construction, the way all human experience is constructed from the raw material of perception filtered through the machinery of expectation and meaning. The room is real. The feelings in it were real, but the unquestioned certainty that this was all there was has dissolved. And now there is a door that was always there but invisible, because when you are completely inside a room, you cannot perceive its boundaries as boundaries. What you are standing in right now is the threshold of that door. You have not left the room entirely. You have not arrived somewhere else. You are in the strange and uncomfortable and necessary space of transition, where the old room is still visible behind you, and whatever comes next is not yet formed enough to be visible ahead. That space feels like emptiness, because you are comparing it to the density and color of what you left. But it is not empty. It is in the process of becoming. And that process requires exactly the kind of quiet, the kind of withdrawal from overstimulation, the kind of reduced appetite for the usual sources of meaning that you have been interpreting as symptoms of deterioration. They are not symptoms of deterioration. They are symptoms of a system reorganizing itself at a level deep enough to require significant quiet in order to do it properly. Consider what happens to someone who has spent years in a state of significant overstimulation. Not the dramatic kind, not necessarily, but the constant, low-level kind that modern life provides in nearly infinite supply. The noise of other people's urgencies, the manufactured excitement of things designed to provoke excitement without offering anything beneath it, the social performances required to maintain a certain image, the addictive loop of seeking and receiving small doses of validation or novelty or stimulation that provide just enough relief to keep the seeking going without ever quite satisfying what is actually being sought. That kind of overstimulation, sustained over years, creates a calibration problem in the psyche. The threshold for what counts as interesting or meaningful gets set higher and higher, not because the person is becoming numb, but because the system is attempting to compensate for an input that was never truly nourishing. It is the psychological equivalent of eating food that is engineered to taste intensely while providing no actual nutrition. You can consume enormous quantities and still feel empty because the emptiness was never about quantity. When a person begins to withdraw from that loop, intentionally or not, the initial experience is almost always flatness. The things that used to provide stimulation no longer do, because the system is recalibrating toward a more honest threshold. Things that were exciting because they were designed to exploit certain psychological responses begin to reveal themselves as slightly hollow. The colors of that world go flat. The music loses its urgency. And in the absence of those stimulations, what remains is a quiet that has not yet been populated with anything new. The flatness is real, but it is not the flatness of a screen that has gone dark. It is the flatness of a screen that has been reset and is waiting for a signal that actually carries something true. What comes to fill that quiet, when it is allowed to remain quiet long enough, is slower and less dramatic than what was there before. It does not arrive with fanfare or with the quality of excitement that the previous sources provided. It arrives the way light arrives in a room in the early morning, gradually enough that you cannot point to the moment it changed from dark to visible, but genuinely enough that at some point you realize you can see. It arrives as a different quality of attention, a different capacity for presence, a different relationship to ordinary things, not the performed appreciation of someone who has been told to practice gratitude, but something more fundamental and less effortful, closer to the natural recognition that a thing is real and that its reality has weight. And yes, before arriving there, you will spend time in the quiet that is not yet filled. You will spend time in a version of yourself that does not seem to have access to the satisfactions that others seem to be accessing around you. You will have days when the distance feels permanent, when the warmth feels gone beyond recovery, when the question of who you are in the absence of all the frameworks you were using to answer that question becomes genuinely vertiginous. You will probably feel lonely in a specific way, not because you are without people, but because the experience you are having does not have a commonly spoken vocabulary, which means that even when you try to describe it, the description lands slightly wrong, and that can feel more isolating than silence. That loneliness is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged as real, not reframed into something spiritually significant in a way that bypasses its actual texture. It is lonely to be in a process that takes place largely in silence and largely alone, even when surrounded by others. It is lonely to have outgrown certain ways of connecting and not yet found the new ones that will become possible on the other side of this transition. It is lonely to watch people around you engaging with a version of the world that you can no longer quite engage with in the same way, not from arrogance, not from superiority, but simply because something in the structure of your perception has shifted, and now you see the seams that were invisible before. That seeing does not make you better than the people who do not see them. It simply makes you someone who sees them, and seeing them comes with its own particular weight. There is a temptation, particularly for people who have developed a certain relationship to intelligence or understanding, to interpret all of this as evidence of elevation, to read the distance from ordinary stimulation as proof of having accessed a higher tier of experience that others have not reached. And here it becomes important to say something that is easy to omit when describing a process like this. None of this makes you special. None of this elevates you above anyone else. The moment you begin to use an expansion of awareness as evidence of your own superiority, you have immediately contracted that awareness back into the old territory of ego, which is exactly the territory you're in the process of reorganizing your relationship to. You have simply replaced one form of self-flattery with a more philosophically sophisticated one. This is worth sitting with carefully, Because the version of this experience that becomes an identity, that becomes a way of distinguishing yourself from the people who are still asleep, who are still trapped while you have found your way towards some private enlightenment, that version is not wisdom. It is the same impulse that drives every other form of hierarchy, dressed in the language of transcendence. The person who has genuinely moved through something like this does not carry it as a badge. They carry it quietly, and if anything, it makes them more patient with others, more genuinely humble about how much they do not know, more able to sit with people in their own confusion without the compulsive need to explain to them what is happening and why. The intellectual arrogance that can accompany this kind of shift presents itself as discernment, but functions as contempt. It presents itself as clarity, but functions as isolation. There is a particular coldness that can come from having understood certain things, and that coldness, if it is not recognized for what it is, can become a way of being in the world that is just as disconnected as the numbness you were afraid you had become, except now it has a philosophical justification, which makes it harder to see and harder to question. The point of seeing more clearly is not to see other people less charitably, but to see them more charitably, with more awareness of the forces operating on them, with more genuine patience for the struggles that come from being human inside a world that is, for all of us, genuinely confusing. The expansion of awareness is only as real as the expansion of compassion that accompanies it. Without that, it is just a new form of the same contraction, dressed differently. The happiness that waits at the end of this is not the happiness you are probably imagining, not the return of the vivid brightness you remember from before, not the full-body enthusiasm for things that used to come easily. That is not a failure. That kind of happiness, the kind that depends on certain levels of stimulation and novelty, was always somewhat fragile, somewhat dependent on conditions outside your control, somewhat borrowed against a future that would inevitably come for the debt. What becomes available instead is something more reliable and more sustaining, a steadiness, a genuine okayness with what is, a capacity to be in ordinary moments without the constant restless search for the next thing that will provide the feeling that the current thing is not providing, a quiet aliveness that does not announce itself, but is simply there beneath the noise, stable in the way that things are stable when they are rooted rather than excited. This is harder to desire because it is harder to imagine in advance. We have vivid memories of the excitement and brightness and intensity of feeling that characterized earlier parts of life, and those memories make a compelling case that what we want is the return of those experiences. But desire is calibrated to what it has known. It has not yet known the particular quality of what comes after this kind of reorganization, so it cannot yet orient toward it with much confidence. You are being asked, in a sense, to trust a destination you cannot yet envision clearly, on the basis of evidence that is largely internal and largely quiet and therefore hard to verify from inside the process. That is genuinely difficult. There is no way to make it not difficult, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But there is a difference between difficult and wrong, and the experience you are having, while difficult, is not wrong. It is not a malfunction. It is not the beginning of a permanent gray that replaces the previous colors. It is a transition with all the real texture of transition, the genuine loss of what was, the genuine uncertainty about what comes, the genuine discomfort of being between. All of that is real, and all of that deserves to be acknowledged, rather than fixed. You are not broken. You are not cold. You are not losing yourself, or drifting into some fog that has no exit. You are something more uncomfortable and more interesting than that. A person in the middle of a genuine change, at a genuine depth, in the particular kind of silence that change at that depth requires, paying a price in the currency of ordinary stimulation for something that does not yet have a fully visible face. That is not a comfortable thing to be. It is also, when seen clearly, not something to be afraid of. It is something to move through with as much honesty and as much patience as you can find, trusting not in some external promise of what waits on the other side, but in the simple logic of the process itself. The quiet that has settled over things is not the quiet of a life going dark. It is the quiet of a life going deeper. The two feel identical from the inside, at a certain stage, which is why the fear is understandable, which is why the self-accusation makes a kind of sense, even when it is not accurate. But feeling identical is not the same as being identical. One is loss. The other is the cost of a particular kind of growth, a growth that requires stillness the way certain seeds require winter before they can germinate, not as punishment, not as withholding, but as the necessary condition for the specific thing trying to happen. Let the stillness be still. Let the questions remain open longer than feels comfortable. Let the person you are becoming assemble itself at its own pace, according to an intelligence that operates below the level where urgency and analysis can reach. The calmer and more accurate version of yourself that is taking shape inside this silence does not need you to rush it or fix it or explain it into existence. It needs, perhaps more than anything, the simple gift of not being interfered with by the anxiety that mistakes its quietness for absence. You are here. You are in it. That is enough. And there is more, though it will arrive in its own time, in its own form, with a quality you have not yet fully learned to recognize, which is perhaps the truest thing that can be said at this particular moment in this particular kind of becoming. Rest in that. Let the stillness be what it actually is.